Today, I'm going to demonstrate composing a cue with pads and sound design, and these are often referred to as ambient cues, and they can help tell a story in a more interesting and minimal or psychological way. These cues are typically under dialogue, which is a really important thing to practice when scoring for modern media, because from an auditory standpoint, the dialogue is the most important thing. Sometimes these cues can be emotional, and sometimes they're just creating a mood to keep things moving and setting the tone. What we're going to be working with today is going to be under that emotional category, and by the end of the video, you should have a firm understanding of what virtual instruments and libraries work well for this style of scoring, how to arrange them so that the scene or the piece of music stays interesting, and then most importantly, how to build a moment with these types of sounds so that there's a proper arc so that the cue appropriately sets the pace for the story that's unfolding. For anyone watching who's not familiar with me or this channel, I'm a professional composer for film, TV, and video games for about 12 years, and I've written music on tons of exciting franchises and major studio projects. To learn more, just check out modernmediacomposer.com. You can sign up for our mailing list, get lots of free video tutorials, virtual instruments, and a discounted offer on our upcoming premium course, Modern Scoring Mastery. With all that being said, let's dive into how to write ambient cues that can work under dialogue for professional films and series. So the first thing I like to do when creating an ambient cue is I like to sneak in really quietly so that the viewer doesn't really notice the music entering. And I do this with each element so that at a certain point, as a scene builds, the viewer just sort of finds themselves immersed in the story and in the moment. What pads you choose are going to really depend on the style of the score and the nature of the story. There's obviously a never-ending sonic range of pads to choose from. I'm going to personally start with one that I use a lot on a couple television series that I write on, and that's called Singing Bell Harmonics. What I like about it is that it evolves naturally, and it has this really interesting tone, and it helps to set the feeling for when you're entering a scene. This is what it sounds like. So it's got this really sort of ambient, almost mystical tone. I think that it helps to enter into a scene really nicely. And as you can hear, it's got those little harmonic sort of tones that are coming in and out. We're just holding down this one middle C note. And then as you'll see, I kind of play around harmonically, just very gently with the fifth and the fourth. Sometimes I'll put a minor third in there. But one thing I want to point out is how I cut the high end of this pad. And the reason that I do that is that it's important due to the dialogue. I don't want those higher harmonic frequencies to get in the way. And I usually like to find sounds that sit a bit below the voices of the characters that are speaking. So this has some stuff in a higher range. As you can hear, when I press down, so I add that sort of high cut filter in order to isolate the sound more, and it's kind of an important lesson that when you're looking for sounds, don't just take everything at face value. Sometimes you might have a really interesting thing happening in an instrument in the mid or low frequency. Don't just go with it. You can make EQ adjustments in order to emphasize and focus on the frequencies that you think are going to best serve the composition and the scene. And again, it's setting just a really subtle tone. I imagine dialogue or maybe just an actor's face or reaction as this is sort of entering the scene. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blend in a sound from a virtual instrument I created called tension pads. This is actually a free instrument that I made for the composer community to use, and you can download it from that website I mentioned, modernmediacomposer.com. There's a patch in here that I just really love called tension bows, and it's a little unsettling, a little off kilter, and I'm just going to blend it in with what we have from before, and I think it's going to set just sort of a nice baseline for us to start building on top of. This is what this pad sounds like. So as you can hear, it's got those really nice sort of trembly features. I think it adds a really nice texture to build off of. And I'm going to add now what I call reversed artifacts. These are basically piano notes And you could choose any piano that you'd like, or it could even be a guitar, basically anything that plucks. And I'm gonna run them through a plugin here called Psychedelic Delay. It's a plugin from Guitar Rig, and as you can see, if I zoom in, basically I hit the reverse button, I put the wet and dry mix all the way up. And that's really important because we only want to get the sound that's coming out of this plugin after it's been reversed. And so basically now what I'm gonna do with that piano is just sort of randomly hit notes that are in the key of the piece of music. So we're in C, so in this case I'm hitting the root note, the C, D sharp, which is the minor third, the fifth, the seventh. We're just gonna kind of play around. It's gonna add this nice little bit of sort of like interesting texture, and it's also gonna add just a little bit of pacing to it. Listen to this. So it's really kind of cool. It helps to add a little bit more ear candy that you can attach onto as a listener. You can see that I've got a couple other plugins here, which is the Auto Panner, again, Black Hole, and then I'm just using the Echo Boy delay to make those sort of reverse sounds last a little bit longer. And again, that just adds a little bit to the pacing. The next thing that we're gonna do is honestly one of the most important parts, especially when you're developing an emotional arc for a scene. And we're gonna introduce some low end now. And that's gonna add some weight and some more emotion to everything. I really love this pad. Again, it's from Omnisphere and it's called Dark Brood. And on its own, this is what it sounds like. So that's gonna add a lot of weight to this piece. It's gonna add a lot more emotion. And when we sneak it in, we actually have a couple different options. Option one is that we bring it in on C, which is the root note. And I want you to listen to how much weight that adds and how it changes the piece of music. So when we bring it in on that root note, you can hear it has a very dark atmosphere to it, right? But another way that we can bring it in is instead come in on the G sharp, which has a far greater emotional impact. And I'm just using this as an example as to how you can use the bass harmonically to sort of influence what you want the scene to feel like. The truth is, this is where the scene itself is going to dictate what to do musically. If we're speaking to a very serious moment, what we just heard is going to work really nicely. But if we're going to go for this more emotional realization or breakdown or anything like that, listen to how this changes the emotional state of the cue just by changing the note that we're coming in on in the bass. So again, the piece is still just at the infancy, but we can hear that that makes a really big difference when we come in on that G sharp as opposed to the C, which is much more serious. This is giving us more of that emotional revelation that we're kind of, I think, gonna build off of and go for. So the next thing that I wanna do in order to start tying all these different layers together is I'm gonna add a piano part. And what I've actually done is I'm gonna add two piano parts, and they come from a free library from Heaviosity that I really love, and that is called Foundations Piano. The first layer is just a plain piano note. But the second layer is playing those sort of pulsing undertones. So what I want to do is I'm going to just add a little bit of reverb, a little bit of delay, so that that kind of just blends into this whole cinematic world that we're creating here for this ambient cue. So what I want to do next is I want to find something a little bit more interesting that's going to kind of stand out, make this piece a little bit more unique. So I'm going to start exploring around a output library called Exhale, which I really like for that. It's got a lot of really sort of ambient vocal textures. It doesn't always have to be something that you can tell it's a voice, but it can be used as a pad or just as a sound effect that you weave in and out. So I'm going to go to this library here. This is a patch called Ethereum. Let's see what this sounds like on its own. I think that's going to blend really nicely with the other sounds that we've set up in here, especially that sort of pulsing piano undercurrent. Let's just take a second to listen back and see how everything's sort of coming together now. Something I just want to point out that, as you can hear, when we process ambient cues with a lot of delay and a lot of reverb and stuff, it's going to kind of help for that sound to spread out and become really, really effective. It's really sort of a thin arrangement. We're not trying to overwhelm people with music or do anything complicated. We're trying to create something that's going to have a mood, and that mood will then support a scene. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add to this with another free instrument that I love. There's a number of free instruments here, which is really cool. And this is from Spitfire Labs, which has just tons and tons of free stuff. This particular patch is called Arctic Swells. These are really cinematic ambient tones. I'm going to sort of introduce them at the same time that the bass is being introduced. So listen to what these sound like. So it's going to have a really emotional texture like that, and I've of course just got Black Hole put on there, nothing else really. And this is what those Arctic Swells with everything else is going to sound like during this section. Again, super simple. You can hear the Arctic Swells are kind of just playing around with harmonies that are in the key of the piece of music. And I think that that's getting really, really effective. You can definitely feel that a scene is unfolding here, and that's sort of the whole point of everything. The very last thing I'm going to do is see if we can just find any sort of unique elements to just kind of bring things home, make things just a little bit more original, and add a little bit more individuality. So let's see what we can find to do that. If you've seen some of my other videos, I really like to blend in sounds from some sample packs. This is from Infinity Samples. They have just really, really high-end sort of textures and wave files that you can drop in. This is going to come from their Cinematic 80s pack. I'm just going to take this sound, put it in here. I'm going to sync it in music mode so that we're in the same tempo. So here's what the sound is like on its own. Alright, so that's kind of cool, and I don't think that we want it as consistent as that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter from FabFilter, and I'm going to bring it all the way down, and then I'm going to just automate it so that when we want to hear this for a little extra texture, it'll come out. You can hear it there very quietly with the filter. Cool, so now let's take that. We're gonna add, again, some delay so it blends in with everything else nicely. I just happen to like Echo Boy. It's one of those things where it's kind of like a one and done. Really easy to navigate and use. Again, no endorsement, just my personal preference for working with it. So the last thing I'm gonna do is I just wanna kind of tie everything together. I'm gonna take this synth motif that I've written right here, and it just goes like this. It just keeps repeating, but what I'm going to have it do is I'm going to have it sort of ebb and flow by adjusting the modulation at different parts of this composition. And I think that just by having it poke in and poke out and sort of reverb out, it's going to blend with the other harmonies and the other textures, and it's going to make sort of like a more cohesive listening experience. As you can hear, it's got a dramatic sense to it. There's nothing too orchestral, there's nothing too traditional, and it works because of how the instruments build. Each one has a moment to sort of introduce itself, breathe, and then the other sounds sort of layer in. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you check out modernmediacomposer.com, there's lots of really high-end, valuable content there. And if you're interested in our first premium course about programming MIDI and scoring to picture for major studio films, series, and games, you can sign up for a discounted offer so you know when it becomes available in the next few weeks. I really appreciate you taking the time to check this out. As always, I hope it was helpful.